price freedom? It's a question we very rarely need to consider. We can usually take our liberty pretty much for granted. Democratic government in a developed Western nation such as ours is largely permissive, as long as we're not actually breaking the law. But during a pandemic, everything changes. Lockdown, enforced separations, shopping and logistical difficulties very soon become irksome. And when they are relaxed, only to be reinstated soon afterwards, just as life was feeling a little more normal, it's deeply frustrating. A similar problem attends the newly liberated Israelites in today's Exodus episode. While work and social conditions in Egypt were harsh, there were some compensations. Being captive aliens was not all bad, but now they are on the road, life is considerably less secure. Surviving the extreme desert conditions is challenging, bad enough for the young and fit. But what about the frail and vulnerable? Moses has already faced the challenge of managing their miraculous escape, but now more domestic concerns are causing unrest. Would their liberating God simply let them die of malnutrition, though? The underlying priorities now are going to be A, maintaining trust, and B, unity, before they can begin building a different relationship with the God of their ancestors. The aftermath of the crossing was far-reaching. The people's elation soon gave way to dissatisfaction. I know how hard it was for them. They hadn't been nomadic desert dwellers in generations. It was a very different way of life, just like my time in Midian. No more relying on the Egyptian supply chain then. The few provisions we had were soon gone. As I did my rounds to offer encouragement, I heard many a voice bemoaning the loss of onions or melons or cucumbers, meat and plentiful bread. They'd forgotten, it seems, the long hours of drudgery in the fields to grow that produce, the back-breaking work of cultivating and irrigating. And those who still bore the scars of the taskmaster's whips, whose hands were calloused, who carried permanent disabilities from overwork. They seemed to complain the loudest. Was their constant mistreatment a reasonable exchange for food and shelter then? Thankfulness quickly evaporated in the desert sun. But I knew God would have an answer, even in this barren place littered with the bleached bones of long-dead animals, concealing poisonous snakes and scorpions, and where vultures circled overhead. We kept to our prayers, Aaron and I, at dawn, at midday, and at nightfall. And round the campfires we retold the ancient stories of Abraham and Sarah, the land full of milk and honey, promised to their descendants. God heard our petitions, I know, and he would provide, just as he found a sacrifice to spare Isaac. But if it didn't start raining cucumbers any time soon, would the menu be acceptable? The tribes were footsore and homesick, fearful, many miles from all that gave them security, with no way back. Manna then, unlikely bread substitute, but early in the morning it was everywhere you looked, easy to get, but hardly versatile. We quickly discovered it had an appalling shelf life, so don't assume we could stock up or anything. It was not well received. But the choice was there, eat it or go hungry. How much would be enough, though? Nobody could say. It was strangely, insubstantial. The sort of sweet, which was something. It took a few days to work out the quantities, and then, of course, they must gather twice as much to cover the downtime of Shabbat. The evening meal, well, that was a bit more solid, sort of live mini chicken nuggets out for delivery. You needed quite a few for a happy meal, though. And we had to get used to them too. And how? Today's dish of the day is, well, same as yesterday's, and the day before that, and the one before that. Come back, Egyptian slave drivers, all is forgiven. But to be fair, some of them realised how convenient it all was, literally to go out, gather your cornflakes, enough for everyone, just dish them out. The quail, well, they were a bit more labour intensive, but the supply was reliable enough. It gave them time to breathe now, to live their own lives and to acknowledge the God who had released them. And God, for his part, arranged everything so he could test their character. Did these people have the discipline to live as he directed? Could they learn to be genuinely distinctive, a trailblazing nation, tuned in to his ways? Or would they rebel against a benevolent authority, as they had longed to against the brutal Egyptians? Looking back, well, I could see it wasn't going to be easy. Being subject to a just and gentle rule still meant submitting to a degree. Knowing God, maintaining a relationship with him would mean living differently. Not simply anything goes, just as it had for me. Could this strange newfound liberty be something glorious? Or would it be seen as another yoke and far too heavy a burden? What lay ahead was not just years of uncertainty, unprecedented discomfort, and boring old bush tucker, but a remarkable learning curve. Were things really looking up? The dietary issues were a clear indication that people can be enslaved by more than just other human beings. Had they realised that food would be so very limited, would the 12 tribes ever have followed Moses out of Egypt? But the richer fare in Joseph's adopted country didn't make his race's subsequent treatment there okay, even if millennia later, humankind have still not quite given up on slavery altogether. Moses has a tough job ahead of him. Only once they're on their way out of captivity is it becoming clear that even God's beloved people don't necessarily know what's good for them. And so it continues even now. But living in community, with or without a shared faith, always requires compromise, or to use another unfashionable word, sacrifices, far off into the future. Centuries after God has set the rules for his people in stone, as the 10 Commandments, Jesus would distill the progressively complicated requirements into 2 basic principles. Love God above all, and love your neighbour, who's also his beloved child, just as you do yourself. Adding God into our thinking must ultimately change everything. How we live in relation to others, how we treat our environment, what we make our priorities, and what is truly essential. Even what we understand by freedom.